Welcome to VLGA Connect. I'm Catherine Arndt and you're listening to the national broadcaster on all things local government.
Hello everyone, it's time again for the TGU panel discussion from VLGA Connect. Great to have you with us. Thank you to Hunt & Hunt Lawyers for sponsoring TGU each week. What have we got on the agenda this week? Well, councils uniting on healthcare, more reaction to that Victorian parliamentary report on the future sustainability of local government, and we've got an eerily similar one that's come out of New South Wales in the last week. Two Gippsland council CEOs have announced their departure. What does that mean for the sector? And councils are getting tough on things like illegal dumping and unregistered cat breeding. We'll have a look at a couple of recent cases there. And much more coming up with our panel today. I'm joined by Tony Rownick, as always, from Hunt & Hunt Lawyers. Hello, Tony.
Hey Chris, good to be back on Melbourne soil for a day or two before I head off somewhere else. But good to see you. Highlight of my week, Chris.
Thank you, Tony. You say all the nice things. And of course, Julie Reid would normally be with us. Unfortunately, is unable to join us for this week's discussion. And I'm so grateful to Kendria Pope for answering the last-minute call to step up. Hello, Kendria. How are you?
Hi, good. Thanks, Chris. You'll get my hot takes today, given the late notice of my joining the panel.
And how have you been? What have you been doing to keep yourself busy of late?
Well, I had quite a lot of projects with various local governments across the state, particularly in the governance space, and I've been pretty busy in the last few weeks, travelling around delivering some of the decision-making training for the VLGA, and I've got a bit of time on the road next week before there's going to be finally a break.
Excellent. All right. I'm sure it's a well-earned break
Very
as well.
much so.
I don't know if you've had time to look at that parliamentary committee report that came out into the sector. We hadn't had much time to consider it last week on the program, but we've had lots of reaction since. For example, the MAV has called for a more formal partnership between the two sectors and as far as the implementation of those recommendations go. And a few councils, including Indigo and Wyndham, I think Glen Ira was another, have been very quick to say or request, if you like, that the state government move quickly on implementing those recommendations. Tony, of course, we haven't really had a response from the state government on this yet.
Yeah, that's right. And as you know, it came from the upper house, as we made the point last time, and they don't necessarily constitute the majority on the floor of the parliament, certainly not in the lower house at least. So what I would say is that these are really it was a really valuable exercise in terms of putting together a package of concerns, relevant issues in terms of this financial viability of local governments. But the key now is in the advocacy element in terms of seeking support from Commonwealth and state government to do something about it in terms of some of the changes. And we really I would expect as a minimum that our Minister for Local Government at both at a state level at least, as a report to state parliament, would be providing some response, and I'd be looking for an indicator of the timeline in relation to that.
Yes, all right. Well, we are keeping our ear to the ground. There's been nothing yet as we record this today. Kendria, have you had time to have a look, and what were your first impressions, if so?
I've had a very a brief look at the report. I mean, it looks to be very comprehensive in terms of it reflecting some of the known structural issues in relation to the funding of local government. It's a good reminder, I think, of the challenges faced by councils in respect of managing their liabilities in relation to developer contributions. And by that, I mean the obligation on councils under those arrangements to actually deliver community infrastructure in a manner that might not be fully supported by the cash that's been put into the system. So I think it's a good reminder for councils to keep a check and a watch on their particular circumstances regarding the delivery of those obligations. But more importantly, I think it again raises the issue of the overall taxation system and the share of that taxation revenue, and I think importantly points out the contribution of the financial assistance grants to local government. I think the other discussions around the flexibility of the rating system and differentials and so forth, that's all more about sort of redistributing the rate burden as opposed to a fundamental shift in the revenue distribution to local government within the overall federal system. So I think it's certainly a useful contribution to the discussion, but I don't think there's anything terribly new in what's been put forward and suggested in this inquiry.
Okay. Interestingly, this week there's been a very similar report come out in New South Wales, where a parliamentary committee there has looked at I think they called it the ability for local governments to fund infrastructure and services, and some common themes emerging here. The key recommendations are for a comprehensive review of rate exemptions and concessions and a redesign of the local government rating system. Of course, New South Wales has had the rate-pegged environment for longer than Victoria has had rate capping, and you might argue that that's a longer period of evidence on which to see the impact of systems like this. Not curious though that very much the same sorts of recommendations are being suggested there.
Yeah. So it's definitely a national theme here, and indeed. Sometimes international theme when we get some of those other stories about councils struggling in the UK and that sort of stuff. But that notion to me of just securing local government going forwards in terms of a guarantee that 1% of Commonwealth revenue comes through the financial assistance grants every year. That is in other words saying our 99% of the other revenue is going somewhere else. We, as a sector that has a strong direct relationship with our communities, it can be guaranteed that relatively paltry proportion of Commonwealth revenue. If we knew that, and we knew that in years where there were challenges, the Commonwealth government were doing other things, that we weren't the sector that suffered and we received a lesser share in that year. I think it allows us to do our planning better. We're asked we're asked in the Local Government Act, councils are asked to consider the diversity of the community and the interests of future generations. And very difficult to sort of do long-term projects like that when you don't know you've got a guaranteed long-term source of revenue coming into the council and what that might look like.
So on that point of federal assistance grants, the New South Wales one says very similar things: increase the share from 0.5% to 1% and amend the current Commonwealth grant guidelines per capita distribution method that disproportionately benefits inner city councils. So again, yet to see what will come from that. But the peak body in New South Wales, Local Government New South Wales, has welcomed the report and the recommendations, which they say are generally in line with the submissions that it provided to that process on behalf of New South Wales councils. Okay, so next year it'll be interesting to see what comes from both of those. I think there's a federal process going on as well, which we're yet to see the outcome of. Tony and Kendria, here's a story that caught my eye this week. We talk about the role of advocacy of councils, and often we talk about opportunities perhaps for councils to band together more, both in delivering services, but also joining their voices together on issues. And it caught my eye that 11 Victorian and New South Wales councils have come together to push for a new hospital on the border up at Albury-Wodonga. Tony, this has been a long-running saga there where the two state governments are promoting the rebuild of the current Albury Hospital. The councils say such is the demand that's growing in the area, they should actually be building a new hospital on a greenfield site.
Yeah, well, this is clearly a case of those 11 councils on both sides of the Murray River, of course, reflecting what they believe is a community desire. And I love this whole sense of, we all love, we know there's power in numbers, and 11 is a significant number of councils. But, in months before, a Commonwealth government election, councils, this is the, this is what you need to be doing. This is the gold standard. You need to have your wish list together, talking in your regional groups about some commonalities there, and be very, forthright in your advocacy. So unless you're having those, internal conversations now about what are the priorities and then reaching out to your neighbouring councils, you're being left behind a little. And if there's an imaginary sort of pot of money to give it, give out for largesse in the health sector, then the Albury Wodonga catchment councils have well and truly got a head start here. So well done to them. And I'd say at other regional groups, have a look at this as a model.
Kendria, do you think a grouping like this, particularly being across two states, carries weight with the state governments?
Well, absolutely. I think we've all got to remember that in the 2020 Act, it's made quite explicit right up front in the governance principles that local governments are to collaborate and are to look at the relevance of an alignment with those federal, regional and local plans when they're undertaking their strategic planning. So this is a classic illustration of councils doing exactly what the Local Government Act is asking them to do. So I think it's a great illustration of it. The challenge, of course, being that state governments also need to work in a collaborative manner in order to deliver something which is potentially a regional based service within a broader catchment, and leave aside those issues that state governments always face when it comes to cross border initiatives. So I think it's a fantastic example, and it's exactly what the Victorian Parliament has instructed councils to do. So it would be great to see if it could progress in a collaborative manner with the support of the two relevant state governments.
I'm just going to jump a little down our running sheet here, Tony and Kendria, while we're talking about the role of councils in an advocacy space. There's also a role of councils in an enforcement space, and there's a real scourge at the moment across the board really on illegal dumping, not just an Australian problem too, I might add. I see regular stories out of the UK, for example, where they call it fly tipping. It seems to be increasing, and I was interested to see that Mitchell's Shire Council has fined 6 different cases of illegal dumping recently. And then in Knox, we've got a successful prosecution of unregistered cat breeding. Important roles that councils have here in that enforcement space. I might get your thoughts firstly, Kendria.
I think with particularly in relation to waste, as councils increasingly work within an overall approach which is intended to further, the circular economy and appropriately price the waste that's generated in the municipality, you've got this other then effect that flows on from that, which is certain operators seeking to avoid payment of the proper prices for the treatment of their waste. So whilst you might have, better recognition within council of the price and better funding of their waste services, you've then got a real challenge for councils in having to then also resource the enforcement activity, which may well need to be increasingly resourced in order to deal with those operators that are seeking to avoid paying the appropriate sort of waste charges. So yeah, again, it's one of those situations where the policy settings are increasingly very effective and well designed, but the unintended consequence is that councils probably do need to spend more and more on enforcement activity, which comes at a pretty significant cost to them.
It does, and that might be one of the reasons behind this emerging strategy, I think, Tony, of councils being very, very public and open about the actions that they're taking to stamp down on these types of activities.
Yeah, you're right. It's getting that message out there as really to encourage the appropriate behaviours rather than just dealing with things when things go wrong. And I think, on that vein, in terms of cost, Knox City Council would be very happy. Bruce Dobson, there, the CEO, that in relation to that prosecution of illegal cat breeders, that not only did the Ringwood Magistrates Court find that you know, the business was guilty and there was a conviction and a significant fine, a six-figure fine to the people who ran that illegal cat breeding business. But the defendant was ordered to pay council's legal costs. So there was some recovery here, because often it's the case that councils do get dragged into inordinate costs in relation to enforcement. I've heard of $35,000, $40,000 costs in relation to a dog that is being declared a dangerous dog, and people spending all sorts of money challenging that. The illegal dumping of waste, it's just a perennial problem, isn't it? And we've tried CCTV cameras, we've tried signs warning, you know, in dumping areas, warning individuals that their registration numbers might be followed up, photographed. In this instance, in Mitchell Shire, we've had members of the community assist in tracking down 6 of the offenders and having them identified and fined. So yeah, it's a community problem, as in many cases, as well as a council problem. And unfortunately, we're just not going to we sometimes feel like we're fighting a losing battle with some of these things, but we just need to persist as councils and hope that ultimately the message gets out, and there's a change of behaviour in the community.
I wanted to echo Tony's comments there. I was actually really surprised to and pleased to read of the outcome of that enforcement action that was taken in relation to the Knox case, because I mean, those numbers, the fine was not at all insignificant, and that sends such a strong signal to operators in the municipality and indeed statewide, that, you know, I think that's certainly a really good result. So well done on the council for successfully pursuing that particular operator. You know, there's obviously not just there's serious animal welfare concerns in relation to those illegal operations. You know, whether it's cat breeders or puppy farms, and that's obviously a massive challenge in many councils. But the more successful and effectively prosecuted these sorts of actions are, the better for the sector as a whole. Absolutely, it was a really good win.
It was, and as it was pointed out, greed being the motivating factor there, financial greed, and that 10-year ban on running animal businesses, I think, is just as good, perhaps, as that significant fine that's been imposed. I noticed a couple of other councils coming out this week with comments about gaming machine losses. Digging into this, there's been some figures released showing that the community benefit scheme that pokie venues are required to contribute to, apparently the amount of money that's been put back into community benefit has significantly increased year on year. But as two councils, Hume and Monash in particular, have said, that scheme is, I think it was the Mayor of Monash described it as it's a PR opportunity for venues, and it's never going to repair the damage that's caused by gambling, and particularly electronic gaming in communities. The figures just continue to be quite staggering in terms of losses.
Yeah, it's a real rearguard action by the gaming industry, I think, here. And you said, look, there's more funds coming through that community benefit scheme. I think there's a fear in that industry that there might be some real legislative reform, and there's a fight back there. I see that there's this bill before the Victorian Parliament around, you know, pre-commitments and with carded play. So you play through a card rather than cash, and then there can be limitations placed on the value of your gaming through the card. But what struck me is that it's a pilot program, and I know various sort of people in the community have been very strong on this issue. Reverend Tim Costello comes to mind, have been very critical about the fact, well, why do we need a pilot program? Why don't we just implement this as a system? The full reforms don't come in until 2027. There are some communities about the place, Hume and Monash have been in the media this week, that their losses in their municipalities are in the order of $150 million a year. you know, that's taking just a great chunk out of, you know, family budgets, local economies, that just having a horrendous impact on and flow-on effects through those communities. So I think councils have been quite outspoken about this issue in the past, and I think that we might be seeing finally some traction in reforms.
Let's hope so. Kendria, any thoughts?
You know, I think you're in a challenging position. So, you know, of course, local governments are going to welcome efforts to mitigate the impact of this problem in the community, but ultimately, you know, some of these approaches are just inadequate to the magnitude of the problem. And so I think local government's in a very difficult position here, because they probably do need to support efforts to minimise harm, but with a knowledge that fundamentally the kind of numbers we're talking about in terms of community benefit and the dollars being invested in community benefit doesn't really even touch the sides.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's a very difficult position that local government's in here. And, you know, I know that certainly, you know, I've kept across what Hume has been advocating, you know, over many years, and they've had a very strong position in relation to, you know, gambling harm, and have been very strong advocates for reform. And very consistent advocates for reform, but I ultimately, you know, I despair, thinking, you know, the state government is so heavily dependent upon these revenues that I fear that more fundamental change is still a long way off.
Yes, okay. Interesting perspective, and I'm sure you're probably right. I just want to make the point that the VLGA has been involved in this space for a long time as well, through that Preventing Harm from Gambling program a couple of years ago now, and the local government working group on gambling. And I'm sure that work will continue as people try to, I guess, maintain the focus on the harm that's being done there in communities.
I think a good thing, Chris, is that, you know, there is a lot of research going on in this area, and that these efforts, you know, are backed up by some really solid sort of evaluation. So things that do work, you know, hopefully will then be able to be, you know, trialled and supported. I just think that the magnitude of the problem is just so significant that it's going to take a lot over a long time to actually start to really make inroads.
All right, we'll keep up the fight, though, of course. Now, I wanted to note a couple of CEO announcements just in this last couple of weeks. We missed one last week because we basically forgot. I want to touch on that now. And this week, we've had a second resignation of a council CEO out of Gippsland. So last week, Mark Dupay announced that he'll be finishing up at Bawbaw Shire Council before the end of the month. Spoke to Mark, nothing sinister here. It's a timing issue for him, whereas he's ready to step back and take it a little bit easier, but he'll still be around the local government sector, and we hope to see him from time to time in perhaps different sort of interim roles or commentary roles. You might hear him pop up on VLGA Connect or Local Government News Roundup perhaps in the future. And then Karen Ellis has announced this week that she's leaving South Gippsland Shire Council and taking up a role in the Victorian Ombudsman's office, where she says she'll continue to be involved in the local government sector. People are a bit not so much surprised by Mark, because I think he's sort of been flagging, he was thinking about this for a while, but Karen's come as a bit of a surprise, and the general prevailing thought this week has been what a loss to the local government sector. I know she'll be still in the public sector, but it is a shame, I think, Tony and Kendria, to see someone of this calibre lost to our sector. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that you know, that there's careers, people change and want to do different things, and I think that if Karen is off to the Victorian Ombudsman, that is an entity that has a lot of involvement in local government.
Yes.
I think, if I remember, I read somewhere, I think most complaints are about Victoria Police, and then the second amount of complaints is about councils.
I think that's
that
right.
the Ombudsman gets. So, so that'll be great to have someone who just understands the way councils operate in at the Victorian Ombudsman. I'm not sure of her role. I've got to deal with Karen and Mark both over the years, as I think perhaps we all have, and both lovely people, both very articulate and have strong opinions. And Chris, also TGU viewers, so please don't leave us. Mark and Karen, we need you. We need your numbers.
Well, that's really what I'm most concerned about, Tony. Very, very diligent viewers and listeners. I'm sure they'll still be hanging around. Kendria, this thought though of the brain drain, if you like, from council land, is that something we need to be more concerned about?
Well, I think, overall, there are some real challenges that the sector faces in terms of, being able to attract and retain certain skill sets. But, in these specific examples you're talking about, I don't know that so much, a loss from the sector where, in fact, you've got individuals moving into the state government, and that can only be a great thing in terms of improving over time the understanding within the state sector of the reality of working in local government and the challenges of working in local government and the great degree of accountability that exists in local government and the demands on them. So I think there's a huge benefit in at the state level having more experienced local government operators moving into it. That can only be a good thing for local state relations. But that's not at all to diminish the immediate significance of key people in the sector moving around. But overall, I think the more sharing of expertise and perspective and the more ability there is for, skilled individuals to move between state and local and from state to local government, I think is an ultimate benefit for the sector in the longer term. If there are ways we could more formally in an organised fashion organise that, I think it would be really advantageous for the sector as a whole and for our relationship with the state government.
And it's not lost on me that you've done exactly that yourself, worked across both spheres.
I have, and I've continued to remain involved in both in some capacity. So I think that the key thing is to not see it as a one-way move.
Yeah.
You really need to be able to facilitate more two-way exchange of skills and perspectives. And it's very different in local government. I mean, we all know that, we all talk about local government as closest to the people, but the sense of, proximity to the community and the real accountability that exists in local government is something that is not well appreciated at the state government level, where people work in big departments that are perhaps buffered from, the reality of the gallery, let's say, and a community that is very able to and frequently does stay in touch with elected representatives and the organisation. It's a very different world, and I think the more we can learn about each other's, challenges and the opportunities for expanding that knowledge, I think that, all the better, absolutely.
Yeah, I agree. You've got to be pretty special to have the mobile phone number of your local, your state member of parliament or your federal member of parliament, or indeed even be able to contact the head of a department directly when you're a member of the public. And at a council level, the mobile phones are on the website. It's expected that the councillors respond to members of the public. And indeed, the CEO is constantly receiving, those sorts of submissions and approaches, as you say, through the gallery at a council meeting, all those sorts of approaches. So closest to the people. I agree with that.
So we have 9 Victorian councils that are currently in need of a permanent CEO. So quite a bit of competition out there, and obviously one of the silver linings of this is we'll see a new crop of fresh blood coming through to those senior positions as well, no doubt.
Sorry, I was just going to jump in, Chris, and say, there are some amazing skilled operators at that second tier in local government too. So, where there's turnover at the top and where that's, that skill is moving into the state system, which, ultimately is to the sector's benefit, then, there's development opportunities for those at the second tier as well. So that's ultimately a good thing. At the same time, all the governing bodies have, recently been through an election. There's huge turnover there. And so, there's a huge opportunity, I think, for then the development of that next round of local government CEOs. So I think there's a lot of positives in turnover, so long as it's kept at a reasonable level, and that the moves are for good reasons. I think there's a lot of there's huge opportunity there in the sector.
All right, thank you for those thoughts. Now let's pause for our very special segment, the final one for the year, from Rhys Thomas. Time to pop down to VLGA Central, where Rhys Thomas is waiting for us. Rhys, hello to you.
G'day, Chris.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm already chuckling because I've noticed the title this week, Rhys with a Spoon. Say it quickly, Rhys with a Spoon. Where did that come from?
Oh, I can't imagine. It's just one of those things.
And there might be a little theme that we see building through your spiel this week, correct?
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I'll look out for that. Look, I wasn't sure if you're actually expecting me back, Chris, but this week, but I couldn't resist another opportunity to walk the line between being accused of legal pedantry and upholding the spirit of the good governance principles. I mean, the fallout from that recent oaths and affirmations process, if nothing else, it reiterated to us the importance of being earnest.
Now, who accused you of being a legal pedant?
Can't imagine.
All right. So what have you been looking at then this week?
Well, I had a bit of a look through the report of the parliamentary inquiry that you touched on last week, although to give it its full title, the Legislative Council Economy and Infrastructure Committee Inquiry into Local Government Fundings and Services. There's the pedant in me.
You can see why we just call it the parliamentary inquiry.
Absolutely. But there is a federal parliamentary inquiry on a similar subject, so we don't want to get the two mixed up.
And there's been a New South Wales one as well that's just come out this week. Did you know?
Oh, look out for that. But look, as you'd be aware, the VLGA made a submission to that inquiry on behalf of our members, and our CEO, Catherine Arndt, and I actually appeared at the inquiry and spoke to that submission. We were pretty pleased that the recommendations we made around cost shifting, the rate cap model, grant allocations, all featured in that final report, because we've been advocating on behalf of our members. But the question is going to be, what's the follow through? I mean, I was listening to your discussion this Wednesday past with Jim McGee on Local Government News Roundup, which is the morning show of choice on my commute. And I was struck by his observation that it largely reiterated things we already knew, actions we already knew to be taken. And I'm not sort of surprised that that's what he concluded. What's now important is how the government actually responds to it.
Yes, and of course, we're all waiting for some sort of response. What, if anything, did jump out for you, though, Rhys?
Well, there were a couple of things, because at the VLGA, we're always turning our minds to how can we support the sector. And there are some things that it recommended that we're already working in that space. So one of them was in shared services, and they made a recommendation that the Victorian government support shared services, which is a pretty broad statement that pretty much could mean anything, I imagine. But when you look in the report at actually some of the comments that were made, there was the Adele Drago-Stevens, who's the Director of Corporate Services at Macedon Rangers, said 79 councils are often getting legal advice from consultants on the same issues because they're coming and hitting us all at once. How can we make sure that we're doing more to share that advice and actually maybe asking a couple of times instead of getting 79 different pieces of advice and paying for it 79 times?
Yeah, true.
Trevor Areno at Indigo Shire Council, he's the CEO there, he said something very similar. Why are we all going to consultants to write our own spending our own time to write our own policies? One person could do it all and could share it. Let us have the same transparency policies, the same privacy policies. Why aren't they all just the same? We're not that different to each other. And I think it's a good point that they both make. And that's that your governance doesn't need to differ depending on where you happen to be located, whether it's Portland or Port Melbourne, Pleasantville or Sweet Home, Alabama. Look, I think there's a role for the VLGA here, and that's why our focus is on supporting councillors and those who work with them. We've plugged some gaps in the governance advice space with our Governance Insights series this year, and we'll be doing more of that and trying to ramp that up through next year. And in the policy space, next week we'll be launching the first of two model policies that we've produced for the sector, a councillor social media policy and a councillor confidentiality policy. And I spoke to governance officers about those policies at a meeting we had just yesterday. So these are the first in what will be a series of resources we'll be developing. A model dispute resolution policy is in the works. Some councillor training support materials will likely follow. So, and hopefully maybe our contribution will avoid some of the spending on consultants that Adele and Trevor were talking about.
And there's already been some great feedback from the Governance Insight series that you launched this year, Reece, which has saved a lot of people quite a bit of time and effort.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear it, because I think one of the bits of feedback we get is it's really useful to have somebody that's actually understands how similar we all are as councils and doesn't sort of try and force us all to reinvent the wheel. And look, we know, and I know, of course, that every council and every community is unique, but the similarities we have are much greater than our differences. And in the way we govern our sector, it really shouldn't matter whether your hair is black, brown, red, or legally blonde. We all have the same policy needs. And actually, on that subject, on the subject of shared services, I was interested to see the passage of the Local Government Amendment Act 2024 in Western Australia this week. They had an interesting inclusion among a whole series of reforms, which is they've introduced the ability for two councils to share a CEO or other senior staff member. Look, that might be a wild idea, but perhaps it's something for us to contemplate.
Absolutely. So, just digging for those references there, Reece, which is distracting me slightly. But you've raised a really good point too. And it happens in Tasmania. I'm aware of a couple of councils there that share a general manager. So it's not like anyone's reinventing the wheel here.
No, and there's no legal impediment to it here in Victoria, but nobody's taken the plunge yet. It will be interesting to see as cost shifting continues to bite and budgets continue to come under pressure, whether somebody actually goes down that pathway.
Yeah. Councillor training is another area that I know caught your eye.
Yeah, that jumped out at me because the recommendation that the committee made is that the Victorian government ensure requirements around councillor training and professional development be adequately funded. Now, I hope that's not interpreted as a way to impose a funding obligation as an additional cost on councils. What we'd like to see is a commitment from the state government for some sort of funding stream to support councillor professional development. And at a cost probably in the order of 10% of councillor allowances is about what we think would be necessary. So those councillors would be even potentially higher, though, for a small council located in a far off place. But look, that amount over Victoria would be in the order of 3 million. So that's no small ask. But given the acknowledged need for ongoing councillor professional development, together with the introduction of the mandatory obligations now, I think it's an investment in good governance for the sector. So here at the VLGA, we'll be communicating with our members pretty soon about how we can support their ongoing professional development obligations. And no doubt there'll be a bit of a well-earned rest now for many. Now the induction programs are either complete or well underway for most councils. But in the new year, we'll no doubt undoubtedly focus our minds again in supporting councillors to be the best they can be, and having the best laid plans in place will be a good place to start.
Heading to IMDb as we speak. Now, there's a milestone this week, Reece.
Oh, there he is. And I couldn't help but let it pass. And that was, we talked earlier in the year about the 30-year anniversary of the beginning of amalgamations. Well, this week saw the 30-year anniversary of the end of local government amalgamations in Victoria. They began in June of 94 and they concluded on the 2nd of December 94 when the last of the new councils were created. And I see a number of them are marking that occasion this week on their social media channels, one of which is Wellington Shire, which holds a special place of significance for us at the VLGA because a former City of Sale councillor, John Jargo, was one of the driving forces behind the establishment of the VLGA. He's no longer with us, unfortunately, but he was an early president of the VLGA and went on to be elected to the first Wellington Shire Council. So he was, well, I wouldn't want to let this occasion pass without acknowledging his contribution. And I thought we'd finally put amalgamations behind us now, 30 years. But again, in that conversation you had with Jim McGee earlier this week, I couldn't help but he noticed that he thinks it's still very much on the table. Watch this space, I guess.
Yes, absolutely. It's always good for a provocative discussion, isn't it?
It is. Look, it can't hurt. And there's no doubt that amalgamation of service provision is on the
Yeah.
table. In fact, it's already happening. So
Yeah, true.
whether it's amalgamation in the way we saw it in the 90s, or whether it's merger of two councils, which is a provision that's currently legislatively provided for in the Act, who knows what it'll look like, but there's no doubt that we're continuing on a trajectory of change.
Excellent. Thank you, Reese. Thank you for all those there we go again. Reese Witherspoon titles that I didn't know existed, hence the IMDb reference. I think you got up to 9 or 10. I must check the counter.
That's not bad.
That's not bad. Well done. Now, can I extend a special invitation to you to perhaps step away from this plug-in segment and come join the panel for a year-end reflection next week?
Oh, I'd love to.
Excellent. All right, let's do that. Thank you, Reese. Great as always. Good to hear from you, and we'll see you next week.
See you then.
Well, he's worked overtime on that this week to weave in all those Reese Witherspoon titles. I'm not sure how many of you got them all, but certainly JLF was on the job there to help us. Well done, Reese. You've earned a break, other than, I think, a special appearance on next week's final show for the year. Tony, a couple of stories that caught your eye, I know, in the past couple of days. The Christmas Grinch at Yarra City Council was one.
Yeah, so this is according to reports. I've got to say, I think there was a report in The Age about a Christmas Grinch living in Yarra Council's IT department, was the story. So I gather council staff at Yarra, City of Yarra, received an email on Monday afternoon, and the subject line was bonus e-gift card from Yarra City Council. And it went on to say that, you know, Yarra Council appreciates your hard work and contributions throughout the year. And as a token of our gratitude, we're pleased to announce a one-time Christmas bonus for each of you. Attached is an e-gift card as part of your bonus. But of course, if you went and clicked on the attachment, as many staff would have, you got a message: thank you for participating in a phishing campaign. You recently, signed some training courses now because you need to learn about the risks of phishing, and this original message about the bonus was all part of this internal phishing campaign. So clever, but I think some staff, and indeed I think the mayor wasn't overly impressed. I think Stephen Jolly made some comments about it. He didn't quite like the way it was done, but I thought quite clever. I understand what's trying to be achieved here. Maybe got a few people a bit excited about how they were going to spend their little Christmas bonus.
I think more likely, Tony, they were probably embarrassed that they clicked on it and got caught by the phishing exercise. This is not new. It's not uncommon for IT departments to do this as part of their cybersecurity awareness activities. Candrea, you would know that full well.
Yes, and I do feel the sting. I can absolutely understand how staff might feel a little sheepish if they fell for it. But this technique is proven to work, you know, and I mean, ultimately councils do hold a lot of sensitive data, and it's really important for the community's, you know, benefit and protection that councils actually engage in proven approaches to minimising risk. And I know that regardless of the particular technique used, whether it's an offer of money or some other offer that's put out on email, there's very often a percentage of staff in an organisation who fall for the trick, and I don't think the particular subject line really matters terribly much. They're trying to they're trying to put something out there that is sufficiently enticing, because that's exactly what someone with malintent would actually do. And, ultimately, I think it really comes down to, how you handle it from there. If it's seen as a learning exercise, and if the culture is accepting, and if people don't feel punished and blamed for actually participating in that as a learning exercise, then I think it's all fine. But I do understand why people do feel the sting. But ultimately, I think the IT department is doing exactly what IT security experts would recommend.
Absolutely.
And it's not just always our staff who fall for these things. Very often councils are testing their elected representatives too. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it's an exercise which is intended to promote learning in the organisation. So I can imagine it hurts to end up in the paper, but but this is something that's done in all
Yes,
councils.
these exercises don't ordinarily end up in a national daily. But anyway,
No.
as you say, chalk it up to experience. And Tony, the other one that you brought to my attention was this review that the government's announced of Parks Victoria, a state government agency, of course, but it does do a lot of work with local governments. Should councils be keeping a close eye on this review and what it's about?
Well, I think it has potential to impact on council, depending on what the future of Parks Victoria is. We saw Regional Roads Victoria disappear as an entity, go into the Department of Transport, really without much fanfare or announcement. This story, has got some media. I've heard from multiple sources that all's not well at the moment in Parks Victoria. To be fair, the CEO has departed recently, Matthew Jackson, by mutual agreement with the board, but there's been a lot of controversies at Parks Victoria. The most recent being, the Mount Arapiles rock climbing restrictions and such. But my understanding is with this review that's underway by state government, assisted by Corda Mentha, there's quite a bit of speculation that Parks Victoria, as a unique entity, may not survive this. And for councils, we have many dealings with Parks Victoria in terms of Crown land, arrangements in terms of leases and licenses of that sort of land, and the interface between private land and Parks Victoria managed land, committees of management, this sort of thing. And so I think, yes, I think for many councils, they'll be watching this with interest and seeing what impact it might have on their interface with that part of state government.
And I stand to be corrected here, Kendria, you might know, I think a fair proportion of the landfill levy that's collected, which of course, in large part comes from councils, goes towards Parks Victoria operations.
Not really familiar with the percentages, Chris, but the whole issue of the revenues that were previously collected under the landfill levy, that's a bit of a hot topic, isn't it?
Yeah.
But it's one that probably has been talked about enough over time. But I think those revenues are directed towards the operations of several entities, including those that have a particular sustainability focus. But there's obviously, there's some dissatisfaction that I think the sector has articulated fairly well in respect of how those levies have been managed and used over time. We'll leave it at that.
and that's probably changed a bit over time too, since since I was across it in any level of detail. All right, thanks for bringing that one to our attention, Tony. Just very quickly, I want to give a plug to an upcoming episode of VLGA Connect that we've recorded with David Wolfe at IBAC, the Deputy Commissioner there. Catherine Arndt has joined me for a special episode where we talk about the perceptions of corruption in local government, that piece of work that IBAC does on a regular basis, as well as Operation Leo, which made some findings in relation to Moonee Valley City Council just before the election. And the reason I mention that is we've just had another example this week of the potential for corrupt conduct that, basically calls into question systems and processes at various councils, this time at Canterbury Bankstown Council, where a former manager has been found to have engaged in corrupt conduct by ICAC, along with two other individuals. Again, another salutary lesson, Tony, about procedures in councils.
Yeah, I'm not across all the detail here, but these things are they happen, and I think it's how we react in creating that culture of a speak up culture, as they say, at a council, where if you see something, ask the question, act, that sort of thing. The unfortunate outcome of these really, you know, extreme incidents, if you like, I can point to Casey and say Moonee Valley recently, is that that the public's regard for the entire sector is, to me, undoubtedly impacted by this sort of thing. And indeed, within those organisations, there's a there's a smear on the majority of many of the people feel smeared by this, even if they weren't involved. And indeed, when we look at the recent Operation Leo reports in relation to Moonee Valley Council, I understand that one of the grievances of some of those former and still current councillors at Moonee Valley is that they feel they weren't a part of this inappropriate conduct that was called out through Operation Leo, but because they weren't specifically named as not having, not having been subject to investigation, not having done anything, they feel somehow smeared, and they're asking for, IBAC essentially to clarify the record that they haven't been guilty of any inappropriate behaviour.
In relation to the ICAC case, just to be clear, it was called Operation Mantis. It notes a most serious and obvious deficiency in council was the failure to perform due diligence, and it's made 19 corruption prevention recommendations, including implementing proper screening of prospective employees, developing robust procurement and project management processes to ensure that the public gets value for money, and adopting better practice guidelines on contingent workforce management.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of what Tony has actually said, is quite pertinent. I think that the challenge with managing this in the sector is getting the counterfactual out there. Because there is so much good work going on to put in place appropriate governance, checks and balances into, systems in local government that, is not recognised and doesn't make the news. And there's a huge challenge, I think, for the sector in actually properly articulating all of the work it does from a structural perspective to ensure good governance. That's just a huge issue for the sector. I think, if we could get more of that content out there in terms of what is actually guaranteeing good governance and what is a check on good governance, I think that would be really valuable. Audit committees across the sector are doing a huge amount of work. Performance audits contribute such a significant, intel to the systems in local government to attempt to mitigate these risks, but also, to address them when they do arise. Yeah. So I think if we could get more of that messaging out there, that would go some way to addressing the sort of public perception, which I think is very much distorted by these stories.
In my experience, the probity requirements at local government are so much more stricter and involved than other levels of government, and so we get these stories and we get sometimes a public perception of what's going on at a local government level, and yet no mayor or CEO of any municipality in Victoria is able to accept a significant gratuity from an organisation every year, just declare it and then make a decision later on and so about that organisation, or that organisation stands to gain or lose from that decision, and say, oh, it didn't influence me. And yet the Qantas Chairman's Lounge example, we see that at other levels of government, don't we? We are held to a much higher standard. At local government, no, we ought not be complacent, and absolutely, this is good that if something's gone wrong, it's been discovered and there'll be some corrective procedures. But the gift policy at most councils says something worth $50 has to be declared. These are things that that are somewhat foreign to other, at other levels of government, these standards. So, I think we're doing some things very well.
Echo that. I think that the standards of governance and conduct expectations at local government are quite objectively are superior to the standards set for other levels of government. That when these things occur, they're evidence of a system that is working because someone has clearly called out this conduct and it's been effectively investigated and then prosecuted. The challenge, of course, is just getting that message out there. Because we are facing such a distorted sort of narrative in the public domain around this. But there are very clear differences in the standards to which the local elected representatives are held and their organisations. And I think in terms of the standards, the height of those standards should really be celebrated.
Nice thought to end on, and a challenge there that perhaps we can pick up on in 2025. Thank you, Kendria and Tony, for some meaty discussion this week. Kendria, really appreciate you jumping in at the last minute to fill in for Julie this week on TGU. Thank you.
No, thank you. It's been fun. Thank you, Chris. Thanks,
and
Tony.
Tony Rownick from Hunt & Hunt Lawyers. Thank you to the team there for their support. Tony, I know you've had a busy time and you've squeezed us in today as well. So thank you as always. And we'll see you back for a special end of year edition next week.
Get my Christmas hat ready.
Excellent. We'll hold you to that. As I say, a special edition of TGU will come your way next week with the panel as we wrap up a busy 2024 and look ahead to what might be in store for us in 2025. But that's it for TGU for this week from VLGA Connect. Thank you for listening and watching. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and we'll be back with you before you know it. See you again next time on VLGA Connect.